Hi guys, it's been a while. I've been trying to work on a editable grid of late, only for a few hours really today. Been busy with my new role and moving house and so on the last few weeks, which is why I haven't had the time to post any new videos and so on. But what we're looking at is, I think, going back a couple of months now. Some of you guys were looking at a editable grid to add to the forms. So I've been doing a little bit of work, but it's a Silverlight based editable grid, rather than I think some of the ones that you guys had posted up were JavaScript based. The pure reason being that obviously I'm quite a big fan of Silverlight. I know some of you don't really follow that way of thinking, but Microsoft have sort of pledged support until 2021 for new browsers and so on. They'll carry on supporting plugins and so on. So it's for line of business applications, on-premise particularly. It's a really powerful tool that effectively gives you the full WPF suite of tools through a browser. But anyway, let me just dive into my CRM implementation. So this is my CRM developer organization, and if I go into accounts and open up one of my demo accounts, what I've been working on very simply is much like the contacts grid you can see on the right. I've been doing my own custom grid, which obviously is editable, where this one, obviously, I've just clicked the hyperlink, where this one isn't. The standard CRM grid isn't editable. It's also using the controls I've been working with. You can filter it, so obviously if it was containing particular parts of a name, so I could put the letter E in, obviously it will search for anything containing E, so I've only got 2 contacts associated to this CRM developer account in this instance. So I could say starts with an S, obviously comes up with myself. That's all standard functionality. I've added a little refresh button just so I can click it and it will just refresh the associated contacts. Again, fairly simple to do. I'll go over all the code for this in a second. What we're going to look to do is extend this to add, say, another couple of columns and show how you wire that up, and put some sort of validation maybe, so that if for example we put date of birth in, you don't want the date of birth to be after today's date, because obviously it's not possible to have a date of birth after today. So I'll fire up Visual Studio now, open my solution, so this Silverlight solution I've got this editable grid. Done a little bit of work on it, as I say, today. It was a few hours this afternoon and evening. So you've basically got this main page. If I double click it, it'll open the ZAML editor, where we can see the actual design of the grid. So I just centralize that a little bit. So I don't know how familiar any of you are with Silverlight or WPF, but effectively the markup type of language for defining the form is this ZAML, which is a form of XML. I'm using Telerik controls, which I have a license for. I think they're quite a powerful suite of controls. If you browse the Telerik site, you'll see they do controls for lots of different platforms: JavaScript, HTML, MVC, Silverlight, and so on, ASP.NET. Obviously I'm using the Silverlight controls. They do a 30-day trial, which is full featured. You just get a brief splash screen popping up asking if you're enjoying your demo, if you choose to use these, but obviously the functionality is not limited, and I think even beyond the 30 days the functionality isn't limited, you just lose the support. So if we have a quick look, so effectively I've designed, this is just a user control page, this main page.xaml, and then I've defined a couple of namespaces. The Telerik, when you deploy and create a new Telerik application for Silverlight, it adds this namespace automatically. I've got various subfolders containing various classes and obviously my references, one of which obviously is my ViewModel. My views, I could actually move my view into the views folder. So I've created these folders by just simply right clicking the solution, add folder, and then in each instance giving it a name. So my view models, my styles contains various ZAML files which contain color definitions and brush definitions, again all standard Silverlight and WPF type of syntax. So I've got my standard view, which is this one as we see. I've added the view model namespace because I'm obviously trying to use MVVM technique for building the application. I've defined a design width and height, and default font family, which just defines the, so I've got a busy indicator that loads, and I can call and set to busy to overlay like a message to the user and block the UI so they can't click on stuff. And obviously that font family just controls the style of font that's used on those messages and so on. I then define the data context for my Silverlight control, which is this user control.dataContext, and then my main page view model, which you find under my view models folder, which obviously contains, well, the view model, which is the definition of the various classes and so on that make up the objects that I bind my grid to, and methods for loading data and so on. Let me just collapse a few of these. Then one of the Telerik controls, as I mentioned a second ago, the rad busy indicator, is basically just an overlay that when you set it to is busy is true, it overlays either a progress bar, or if you set it to indeterminate, i.e. you don't know how long it's going to take, it's like a sliding series of dots with the particular theme I'm using. So it's just a means of, if a user clicks something and it's got to do a long running process, it's just a method of preventing the user clicking more buttons or changing the UI. It just sort of overlays over the top of the UI, and you'll see it in action. You'll see what I'm talking about. Then within the rad busy indicator, I've defined a standard grid called layout route, which you can call it whatever you like. There's a loaded event handler called, well, it points to an event handler called layout route loaded. Obviously by highlighting any of these and clicking F12, we can go into that event handler, which is this one here, and that just calls a method from my view model, which we'll cover in a second. So then, as well, within the grid definition, there's a columns definition area. So you can see there's the first column is of automatic width, which is the asterisk, and then a column width of 40. So you can see over here when I hover, there's that 40 popping up above. So that's just defining this column here. So to the right of the design area, there's a column of 40 pixels. Then likewise a row definition. So again, I've defined a row of 40 pixels high, and the final second row is a automatic height, so it will just scale to whatever area is available. So if I had an enormous monitor and I put this web resource and it filled the available space, it would scale accordingly. So that's the column and row definition. Then I used one of the Telerik controls, which is the rad grid view, which is a grid control. Few properties for this. So there's a grouping control where you can, much like in Outlook, where you can group by from and so on. You can drag things up and group them. So I could drag telephone into the group area, and it would group it by telephone numbers, which obviously are unique anyway, so it wouldn't achieve a great deal. But if it grouped by city, for example, all the London ones would be grouped together, and you could expand them out. But in this situation, I don't want the group panel to be available, so I've chosen false. Don't want users to add new rows, but easy enough to set that to true. But then we'd have to actually wire up the Telerik event to actually generate records in CRM, but it's possibly something we'll look at towards the end of the video. Yeah, sort of things like auto-generate columns. I don't want it to base it on the data source that it's bound to, which is this contacts type. This is a custom class that I've made that has various properties. If we did auto-generate columns, every single one of the properties would be mapped, which I don't want, because there's things like GUIDs and that I don't want the user to be exposed to. So that's my reason for doing the auto-generate columns false. Border brush transparent is just so that when it's placed in the CRM form, it doesn't have a thin grey border. There's an event handler for when the row's edited and you hit return or click away and it fires that event. And then standard sort of WPF Silverlight, I've defined the column to span, the column span property to span two columns, so it covers both this column up to this break and the next one, and then the row span the same, so it covers that row and the next, so it basically fills the entire design area. The reason I've put the grid in is to put this button in the top right corner. And then the next part we see is the column definitions themselves. So because we've turned auto generate columns to false, we have to actually define the columns we wish the grid to display. So in this section here where we see this rad grid view columns, I've defined them all as the type of data column. There's various types the Telerik grid support. So I've simply got the full name of the contact, which will come from the full name property, and I've bound that to the full name property within my my contact class. So before I go through all the columns, I'll just show you the contact class. So it's simply just a public class with a number of properties. One which we want to hide, which is used for when we update the record back to CRM, is a GUID, which I've just called contact ID. It's a full name property, telephone, mobile phone, address 1, address 2, city, address, and then a date time, which I've set as nullable so that it will accept nulls if it's not defined, and that way the grid won't show. If I don't set it nullable, when I create a new one of these, obviously per row, the date of birth would be set to the minimum date of birth, or sorry, minimum date time value. So it would look a bit weird to have the first is the first, the year 1. So by making it nullable, if it doesn't have a value from CRM, this can be null, and then the grid will just show a blank column. So going back to the ZAML, so we've got the full name, email address, telephone, city. That completes the column definitions. That's the end of the actual grid. And then the only other thing I've got in the Silverlight component is this rad button, which is up here, which is the refresh button. which is simply, again, it's a Telerik rad button control in the first column. So this is the 0th column over here. So this automatic width one is the 0th column, and then number 1 is over here, this column on row 0. So it's the first row again, or the 0th row. And I've aligned it into the top right corner, so it's as far to the right and to the top as possible. Then it's quite simple. I've just done a dark grey ellipse and then used a vector icon in this path type of object from obviously in this let me just expand it. In this paths folder I've got various vector, these are vector paths to define icons. So the copy icon, if I use this one, it's obviously this long string of mathematical info, which is like any vector image, that defines the vector path for my refresh icon. So that refresh icon there. So what we then see from that icon is this overlaid, well, just saw it briefly until I hovered over it, the sort of rotating arrows, the curved arrows circulating. Obviously I could change that to one of the other icons I've got, either that phone icon or filter icon, save icon, which would be, I think it's a disk. Can easily be bound in place of the refresh icon. So I could change that to save icon. If I build that, you should see it compile, and that icon in the corner should change to the new save icon in a second once the ZAML designer refreshes itself. If it's going to do it. No, I mean, I can show you, because I've wired this up, I'll show you how I've done it in a second, that I can actually run this from within Visual Studio. That's my startup project, is this editable grid, and it will actually create the SOAP, or instantiate the SOAP endpoints, so the organisation service will be connected to, and actually retrieve data from CRM into a grid that I can preview in the browser. So you can see there, it's obviously put the disk icon over the top of the grey ellipse, but it's obviously so big it's kind of overlapped and looks a bit strange. So I'll change that back to my refresh icon, and I can run that again. It'll build it, it'll compile, and then run again within the browser. So we can see there's my icon. So it's got an ellipse that's slightly bigger than the refresh icon, and overlaid on top is the rotating arrows. Obviously I can click that, and you briefly see that rad busy indicator pop up saying loading contacts. Hopefully you can pick that up on the video, but obviously it's so quick to retrieve the 2 records asynchronously that you don't really get much chance to see it. So that's the ZAML. Obviously it closes off the nodes of the grid and the rad busy indicator, so the indicator surrounds the whole of the grid and the button. Then, as I said before, by simply setting the is busy property to true, it sort of greys out or just fades out the controls behind, and the busy indicator becomes prominent, and that way it prevents the user from interacting with the controls behind. That may or may not be something that you wish to happen. I mean, obviously it's quite quick, the process for refreshing behind, so it may be deemed by yourself that it's not necessary to overlay the brief sort of flash up of the loading contacts or the whatever message you've chosen to display. So now we'll look at how I've obviously sort of pulled the data in and draw it in from CRM, and define the actual ViewModel backend. So if we go into the ViewModel, it inherits from this ViewModel extensions. Obviously, I've added a few methods and properties to extend the standard ViewModel base that the Telerik's controls provide. The default one is ViewModel based that you can inherit from, but I've obviously extended that slightly in my Silverlight library, so it's got a show busy property, a busy message that you can set the property and it determines what message is displayed to the user, and so on, and a progress if you wanted to use a progress type of bar, where if you knew the state of the whatever the long-running process was, you could update the progress bar and it would actually have a 0 to 100% progress bar filling up. So I've inherited from the ViewModel extensions, got a simple constructor with calls my wire commands method, which is just to configure these. I'm using these Garlasoft relay commands, so this MVVM Lite library that you can get by just going to the manage NuGet or Nugget, however it's pronounced, packages, and then do a search for MVVM Lite, and it's a free download that you can add, and just makes the process of wiring up your views, buttons and stuff to commands in the ViewModel. So I've defined a command called refresh command, which if I look at the ZAML and click on the button, you can see that on the actual rad button towards the right hand side, that's the command that it will. So when I click it, this is what it will do. So it's bound to that refresh command method. Obviously it's a one-way sync between the two, with the wire. You obviously got one way and two-way. Obviously you probably need to read up on that a little bit if you don't understand it, but effectively that's just wired that button up so that when I click it, it will call that refresh command in my ViewModel. So, and then in this wire commands, I've told it what that refresh command will actually do. So it calls this refresh method, which is what we see here. So when that command's called, it will call this private refresh method, which is quite simple. It sets the busy message to loading contacts, as you've previously seen pop up, then sets the show busy to true, so you actually see the loading contacts message. I've got a factory class that I've written that's got a method called getContacts, which takes two properties. Let me just hover. So it takes a organization service type and a GUID for the account. So it's which contacts related to which account. Then this is using the reactive extensions from the Reactive Labs from Microsoft that came out several years ago to generate, basically to subscribe to the results, because obviously all queries and stuff you do within Silverlight are all asynchronous. So that just subscribes to the factory class method, and when it completes, it will pass the results, obviously this lambda expression, so it'll pass the results into this load result. I then need to use this again. This is from Garlasoft, part of the MVVM Lite. All interactions with the user interface have to be done on the user interface thread, and obviously asynchronous calls like this getContacts will be called on another thread separate to the user interface, because otherwise the user interface would lock. So the way obviously the browser handles it is it calls another thread, goes away, performs this getContacts query, and then calls back into this, obviously after the lambda expression, calls back into this method, and obviously so the results have come back then, this method's completed, CRM's returned whatever records. But because we're going to then interact with stuff on the user interface, i.e. the grid and the results that it's bound to, we need to be performing this on the UI thread. So this dispatcher helper, this check begin invoke on UI method, checks whether you are on the UI thread. If you're not, it calls it on the UI thread, and then calls into this set of functions. So it clears my sorry, I didn't mention I've got an observable collection, which is what the grid is bound to, called contacts. So if I go back over to the ZAML and look at the grid, you'll see the item source property. Where's my Telerik grid? So my rad grid, the item source there is bound to that observable collection called contacts, so which is what we see in the view model. So it's an observable collection of contact type. So in this we saw earlier in the video, it's a collection of these. So for each contact that gets retrieved, we'll have a row entry which is a contact, which is what you see, this contacts observable collection, which is simply obviously standard a get and a set. The only additional property is this onProperty change, which notifies any controls that are bound to it. So if this collection is when it's instantiated, it will notify the grid that this has changed. So when I set this to clear, obviously it will notify, because it will have altered it'll set a different value to it, and it will call the onProperty changed, which notifies the grid that it's updated. Then I simply iterate over the results. There's this contact collection that comes back from my factory class and adds each contact in turn into the observable collection. Once all of those are added, it turns the show busy back to false, so that rad busy indicator goes invisible again, and the user gets control of the user interface. If I have a quick look in the factory class, the contact collection that you saw, there's the return type, is just simply inherits from an extended version of observable collection that I've defined, which just gives it an add range property. Not that I'm using the add range in this instance, but it's effectively an observable collection of contacts with an add range property, or sorry, method, and I've just inherited from that and called it contact collection, which is what I use here in my get contacts return type. So it returns an iObservable contact collection. This section here is just defining the columns that I wish to retrieve from my contact. So from the CRM contact entity, these are the CRM logical names of the fields, so you probably recognise them: the full name, email address one, and so on, address one city. And then my method that you saw called from the view model is this get contacts, which takes two parameters, which is an organisation service property called service and a GUID, which I've just called account ID. Again, using the reactive extensions, the return type, I do a return of observable.create contact collection, which then subscribes this observer and calls that. So when this completes, it calls into this sort of this delegate callback function, which is just my normal query expression. So query expression query, target the contact entity, the criteria is a new filter expression, the column set is this columns, and obviously uses the contact columns to define which columns I want to retrieve. So I don't retrieve everything. Obviously I could just do new column set, all columns equals true, but obviously there's a lot of extra columns. It's a lot more to request from the platform, which is totally unnecessary and would slow the process down. Add in a criteria, which is the parent customer ID, the operator is an equal, and the value is this observable object, so I pass in the account ID. Then I'm just doing a simple order expression, order by full name, and obviously the default is ascending. If you wanted it to be descending, then you can add in order type equals order type descending, but I could have defined specifically the ascending, but it isn't necessary as that is the default. So then I add that order expression to the query, so it will order by that full name, and then I've got these async extensions, which again is a extension method in my Silverlight library, which adds various, so it takes all the standard methods, and it's using obviously the reactive extensions to give me these response types, so I can use these standard messages. And so on, and that then does the retrieve multiple, passes in my organisation service property, passes in my query expression, because if you look, the retrieve multiple has the two property parameters to pass. Again, do another subscribe, which will obviously go off asynchronously and return the results to this query result, and when it's complete, pass into this function here where it defines a new contact collection type called contacts, and then iterates over the query result, because obviously the return type of retrieve multiple is an entity collection. Iterates over each of the entities, and I add them to this contacts collection, but I've had to create this mapping method so it'll convert it between a standard CRM entity type and convert it to one of my contact class types. So that's down here, map entity to contact. So it simply takes an entity as the parameter, declares a new contact type from my data access namespace, this contact type we saw earlier, takes the GUID from the record retrieved and sets that to the contact ID, then does a check on each of the fields, so full name, if the attributes contains a full name, set the full name of the contact class to equal, and then use this get attribute value method that's just a standard part of the CRM SDK when you've added the service reference, and just maps it to the full name and does exactly the same for all of those, and at the end then returns that contact object, that type, back up to wherever it's gone, up to here, and that obviously that's the return type is a contact, so that gets added, and it does the next one, maps it, returns it, adds it to the collection. Once all of them are complete, we call the observer on next, which is one of the it informs the reactive extensions that the sequence, the set of results that are being pushed back have completed, but we don't really need the on completed as well. But obviously if you were doing one at a time pushes, you could from the collection keep doing on next to call the subscribing message, and then at the final one do the on completed. But so that's the method for returning, and obviously that then returns back to the view model which we saw here, where we subscribe to this get contacts, and it's as simple as that really. The other thing is on the, you saw this row edit ended, where if I press F12 on it, so when we go in and edit a row, this is a standard Telerik event handler. I've just done if the edit action is a commit, and then I simply cast the new data, so the row that's been edited, because it's an object type, cast it to the type I know that it is, which is the contact class, and then I call my update contact method in my view model and pass in the edited contact that we've just, so the row that's been edited, pass that to the update contact method, which if I have a look at that, expand it, takes a property obviously as contact, sets the busy message to be updating contact, sets the show busy for the rad busy indicator to true, and then I've got another method in my data factory called update contact, which takes again organization service parameter and a contact type, again subscribes to the asynchronous process and returns it into this update result. That will then step into here when it's complete and just set the show busy back to false. If I have a look at that update contact, very similar to the retrieve, except it's not using a query expression or anything like that. Takes the two properties, calls my update method, which takes the organization service as a property and an entity, so I then have to convert the edited contact back to a CRM entity type. So I've got another method called map contact to entity, so it's just the reverse, and that what that does is creates a new entity, sets the GUID to be the GUID of the row that we'd already set the other way around, so we update, we know which record to update, the logical name, so we know which entity we're targeting, which is contact. I then, because obviously I'm displaying the full name field on the form, we can't edit the full name in CRM, so I'm splitting it based on the spaces, and then if it's longer than one, so if there's two names, I'm setting the first name to be the 0, so this string array of names based on the split. I'm setting the first name to be names, the 0th one of the arrays, that's the first name, and the last name to be the length. So if they put 7 names in there, I want the final one minus 1, because obviously it's a 0th index and the length wouldn't take account of that. It would just be how many items are in the array. And then obviously I could extend that to say put all of the others into the middle name, so that you wouldn't lose the data if they typed in multiple names. What I haven't done is, if the name isn't greater than 1, I just need to decide whether I'm going to set that to be the first name or last name, but we'll just assume it's the first name. So if I just put John in, it would obviously set just the first name. I should probably do an else if and make sure it is actually a length of 1, because if it's nothing equals 1, so if it's nothing, that would cause an error if we were splitting it and there were no members of the array. Possibly we should do an else if the length is 0 and set it to null. So that should be accommodated with an else. I could say an else if names.length is 0, and we could say first name equals null, and that will set the first name to nothing. Possibly if they're not putting a name in at all, we should set first name, middle name and last name, but I won't for now because I don't want to start messing the code up too much. Then we're just setting the email address to be the email address from the contact class type of that row, and telephone same, and city. If I obviously bound more columns on the grid, I'd need to obviously add them to this class so when they get written back. So this then returns this new entity with these attributes defined up to the update method here, which gets passed and then subscribed to, and then it obviously the return type of an update is a boolean. I'm not doing anything with that, but I'm returning just doing the observer on next to terminate the methods to inform the subscribing message that we've completed, and that's it. So if I can show you this outside of CRM. So it's compiled. It hosts it in like a dynamic host page. So I can now, if I delete the full name and hit return, that should connect. You saw the rad busy indicator there for a bit longer because it's the first time I've actually edited it and it's connected. So now if I was to go into CRM on another tab, we should have that contact updated to just Jimmy in the first name. So I can have a look at contacts or not. Not sure why that's not. Let me have a look at the code again. One tip as well, if you're doing any kind of Silverlight work and you want to track the errors or get meaningful errors back, is to use Fiddler, which is another Telerik download, which will give you, and it's useful in a lot of diagnostics with CRM because it's all web-based. So you can see the responses and request types and any errors that come back from the platform. So if name's length equals 1, it should have set, I can put a breakpoint in. Just make sure that's hitting that piece of code. So it's setting the first name. So this entity should have 4 attributes. So we're setting the first name, setting the email address, and so on. So that should have updated that. Oh, of course, because I'm not clearing the surname, so it is setting the first name. That's me being stupid, because I'm not, like I said before, I'm not actually clearing. So where it says it is setting the first name, but really I should have, as I said before, if it's only a single name, I should have set last name equal to null, and that would be true down here as well. That if there's no name, and even middle name should be included. So if I try that again, sorry, it's my poor coding. So if I take off the Spencer bit, hit return, open my record again. So yeah, so it's obviously because it builds the full name from both, and I hadn't actually removed the last name, so now that's been set to null. So if I go back to my editable grid, likewise I could change the email address. Hit return. That's just so you saw the rad busy indicator pop up briefly. Again, go and have a look at the record, and it should have the updated email address, so that it's changed to the microsoft.co.uk. So I did mean to show you in the view model itself, I have that load grid that you saw on the layout route loaded. My ZAML editor sometimes does this, has to refresh it all. So there's nothing actually wrong with the syntax here, it's just the ZAML UI design has crashed. So this layout route loaded, which called this method in my view model, which is this load grid, which if I go to the view model, so this is what initializes the editable grid. So it sets the busy message to loading contacts, the show busy indicator to the rad busy indicator to true, and then I use the standard Silverlight utility that's part of the SDK, and it's got a get server base URL method and then a get SOAP service. I have modified these slightly so I can pass a sort of fallback value. So if I'm not hosting it in the page, this obviously wouldn't be able to get the from the XRM page model, or using the get context method, wouldn't be able to. So if I look at the get context, it's expecting to have the XRM proper. So from the parent page, it tries to get this XRM property to then use the get global context JavaScript method to retrieve the context, and then obviously get the base URL for your client URL. But obviously if you're not hosting it and you're running it within Visual Studio, that would fail because it hasn't got access to the context, because there is no XRM page object model. So I've used this fallback option where here you can see it's a null, so it's an optional parameter, and if that fails, then it will just actually pass back that that URL that I've passed in, the fallback URL. Then obviously we get the SOAP service from that base URL, and that just instantiates the SOAP endpoint, the organization service basically. I'm setting them in this global variables within my app ZAML CS file, which is the main kind of initializer for the whole application. This is the entry point, this app ZAML. That initializes all the components and sets the startup page and which view to initialize with. Then I've got a get CRM params. So because in my CRM form, if I have a look at my account and look at the form designer, this grid. So sorry, I'm forgetting that my monitor's viewable area is bigger than the area of the recording. So where I've embedded this editable grid, if I have a look at it, it's just a web resource embedded in the form. I'm passing the record object type code and unique identifier, so as a data parameter, or I think it's not as a data, that's the data parameter. It'll just pass an ID and a type name property to the the sort of hosting, the control. So the host page receives these objects, so the ID and the type, so it would be the account, and then the GUID will be passed to the web resource. We'll just increase the size a little bit, 12. Just publish that. So what that get CRM params method does is extract those IDs that get passed, so I know which account it's been called from. So if I close that, so in my code, this get CRM params basically looks to see if the query string being passed contains a data parameter, which is what you saw in that little dialog box, that you can pass additional properties and all just separated by ands. So you could pass other field information, so on. If it does, it splits it and iterates over each one, adding it to the Silverlight app's init params. Just adds the key and the value if they don't already exist. And if it doesn't contain a data parameter, then obviously if this is for each item in the query string, so if it's passed the ID, it will add, if it doesn't already exist, the ID and the value for it. If the type name, so the account, it would add a key called type name, and so on. And then if so it's populated the Silverlight's init params collection, then checks if there's any values within there using a standard link any method. If it is, it checks to see if it contains one called ID and it's greater than 0, and if it is, it passes that ID into this object ID global variable I've set in my app ZAML CS file. Otherwise it sets that to an empty GUID. Same with the type name. That's just here. If it doesn't contain any, I'm able to just, so if I'm running it in the Visual Studio, I can pass predefined values. So there's my type name that I'm passing, and there's a GUID of one of my records, so that I can test it outside of CRM where it wouldn't be passed any the data context or the type and so on. And that's it. So the refresh button that we've seen, and that just calls this refresh command, sets the busy indicator, does a get contacts, and just clears the contacts collection and iterates over the results, adding them in one by one. And that's really all there was to it. So I say if I build that and go to my account, if I go to my solution, so I'll go to my editable grid solution, to update the web resources, as simple as highlighting web resources. There's my Silverlight component. I'd simply browse to my compiled, so this bin release folder of my editable grid solution, find my components. There's my editable grid.xap, which is the Silverlight ZAP file, and open, just save, wait for that to clear in the upload, publish. Take a second or two, so that's now published, so I can minimize those. Go back to my account area, open an account, and that'll be the most up-to-date version of my grid, which I don't think we've altered really. There you can just see it reloading for the first time. Obviously from then on, it subsequent reloads of this page, it should be cached in the temporary internet files. So it shouldn't see it should load it locally, you shouldn't see the download from the server or the CRM online. Obviously this will work both on-premise and online. So then I should be able to put hit return, you saw it update. So then obviously this one hasn't updated. I don't know if there is a refresh on the standard form, but if I click on that hyperlink, it should take me to that record. So there we can see the surnames reappeared. If I go back to the form again, it's loaded my editable grid again, should refresh the data. The widths of the columns are automatic based on the content, so if I shorten that down to just that. This is obviously where some validation would be good, because that's an acceptable email address according to my grid. Reopen that. You can see it's accommodated, or updated rather, the new address. If I go back, so it'll automatically call the load grid, and so you can see the columns width has changed based on the content. So what we can look at doing is adding in an extra column, something like date of birth. Might be a good example. I might reload this. It seems the ZAML editor's cocked up on my Visual Studio. It does this occasionally, and then seems to mark it as though it's invalid code, but it isn't. I'll restart my Visual Studio. Otherwise we won't be able to see the additional column being added. So it should load up and present the grid back to us. So in order to add something like the date of birth, I mean, firstly we could put the column in the column definitions here, but we wouldn't have anything to bind it to. So we'd have to have a look at our contact class, which does contain a date of birth field, so that's already done. In my factory class, I would need to retrieve the additional field, which I think is called birth date. So that will now retrieve the extra column, but we're still not obviously mapping it, so it'll be included then in the query, but in this mapped entity to contact, so into our contact class, I need to add the additional field. So I can copy one of the previous ones, change that to birth date, and the mapping, and then obviously the type is not a string, it's a date time. Important to remember though, when you retrieve excuse me, when you retrieve values from CRM stores them as UTC format, so in order to get them correct back to local time, you need to call the local time method. Obviously this is underlined because I've copied, it's trying to map it into the mobile phone field, so I need to make sure I'm setting the date of birth field to be equal to this birth date, and obviously converted back to local time, so it should be midnight on that date rather than 11 o'clock PM in my regional time zone on the day before, which would obviously give you misleading results. So we've retrieved it, this will be populated. Now in the grid we can simply copy one of the rows above, add that in, call it DOB or something, or date of birth if you wish. That's bound to date of birth. Obviously this is case sensitive, so if it's camel notation there with the capitalized letters, I need to do the same on the binding, so it has to be identical. So that's now got the DOB column. If I run that within the browser, within Visual Studio, to save me having to deploy it each time, we should see the extra data come across. If these have got date of births, that is. Let me just bring up our contact. So birthday, so let's just pick something. Oops, sorry. Doesn't really matter when we go back to, but let's just say the 6th of May 1999. Save that. Ooh, wants a value for last name. So save that. So that record's now just saved. Excuse me. If I now hit my refresh button, you can see it's brought the date in, but obviously it hasn't formatted it. So if I go back to my ZAML, just stop that Visual Studio. So we've got this data format string property, so I could just say dd/mm for month, 1, 2, 3, 4. Run that again, so now it should apply that formatting. Obviously if you're months come first, you can set the format the other way around. So now you can see it's obviously with the preceding 0, because I've done it as a 2-digit day, month. So it's set the date of birth. What we haven't done obviously is set on the edit for it to write back. So if I was to alter that, and also the Telerik control is intelligent enough to know, because it's a date time field, it gives me a nice date picker without me having to. Obviously, I think some of the ones you guys might be working with the HTML and JavaScript, you'd have had to. Well, it would have been quite difficult to do a date picker, but that's what I quite like about these Telerik controls, that they're quite intuitive and powerful. So I could set that to say the 3rd, hit return. You just saw it briefly come up with updating contact, but if I were to look at that contact in here and refresh it, and we scroll down, it will be still the 6th of May, because I haven't. So scroll down again, so you can see it's still the 6th of May because I haven't actually modified the code that writes it back. So in my factory class, in this map contact, so the contact class, i.e. the row of data, which is this contact, we haven't set it back to update to add it to the entity. So I'd need to put birth date equals contact dot date of birth, and then when it calls the update method and this maps the current contact back to a CRM entity for the update method, it will have the extra line in it. So what I'll do is I'll build it. So you can see it's just succeeded. I'll browse to my editable grid. It's got time and date now, so it's the latest build. Save that, publish it, take a few seconds so I can close that, minimize that, bring up my account form, refresh it to load the latest version. So it should have the date of birth column. So there we go, we've got the date of birth column. Obviously there's only one date of birth, I could add one now to myself. So let's just put it, let's go a different month in fact. So I'm quite young, I'm only a couple of months old, so 26th of 2nd 2014, hit return. I should now have updated that Steve Green contacts. If I open it and scroll down, you can see it's got the 26th of the 2nd 2014. You can go back to the grid. So again, I could go back in the one I originally wanted to edit. Got the wrong year, so 5th of June 1996. Hit return or click away, so I can click into the next row. It saw it update very briefly. So now if I bring up that record and refresh it and scroll down to the birth date or date of birth area, so now it's the 5th of June 1996. Things like I talked about, you could obviously do validation. The Telerik controls, as I said before, have a lot of different events, as well as like things like this row edit ended. Let me just put that on a new line. I think you've got things like cell. You have to look at the Telerik documentation really. So you've got cell edit ended, cell validated, validating. So they're kind of a pre and post validation. So you probably use one of those, cell validating, for that particular column. So this will be cool. So new event handler, hit tab, it will generate it. F12, and then you could put some validation code in here. So you'd have to probably look at what the arguments passed in contain. So you probably something like this cell, whether it's got a I'd have to have a look, but you could possibly look at if the header was date, because obviously this will do for any cell, and we'd need to make sure it was the date of birth one. So if it's something like the header was equal to DOB, the DOB, we can check. Yes, it's probably going to be something like the parent and then the header of the column. Check if it then was earlier than today. If not, you've probably got something like you can return or set a e dot is valid, I think. Yeah, so if you say is valid equals false, so if you weren't happy with the validation, you could set that to be just is valid equals false, and it would prevent entry of that data into the cell. So yeah, I mean, if we did something like is cell dot column dot header equal to DOB, that's because that is a object type, so we'd have to just cast that to a string. So if the string of the header, probably have to surround that, is equal to DOB, if column yep, so that's okay now. So yeah, we've just cast the header of the column, obviously because it's an object, just as a string, so that we can do the comparison. So if it was equal to DOB, then we could probably cast that row contact C so the current row item in the grid, again because it's an object and we need to compare it, we'd either have to just do a contact in front with the right case, or we could do an as contact and then it would return null if it wasn't a valid cast, otherwise this could throw an exception. But we can then do a check to say if c dot date of birth is greater than or equal to now, and then do that e dot is valid equals false, so that will set the on that cell validation, it will set the property to be false, so we should just obviously highlight in red or something, whatever the control does. So we can try that, where if I just run it from within here, just going to compile, make sure that's pushed in the corner. So it's compiled, retrieving my default record from the GUID I've embedded. So I could set this to be, I don't know if we can get to today easily enough, 14th of May. What if I set it in the future, so it's the 29th of May, hit return, it didn't fire. Let me put a breakpoint on there and try it again. So change that to the future. It does seem to have fired this time, not sure what was going on there. So if I try to exit that cell, you can see it's highlighted in red, and I could put a message that would pop out with the Telerik control that would say reason why, that obviously date of birth has to be prior to today or something. So again, 31st, hit return. So it won't let me exit that cell now until we put the date to a valid one, so I can set it to the 20th, which is a few days ago, and that should be it's stepped into my, no, not sure what's going on. Oh, sorry, that's row edit ended, cell validating. Sorry, wrong window. So it's casting that to date of birth, sets the contact, Still thinks it's... I've probably picked the wrong... I probably shouldn't be using the current item, because unless it gets edited that won't be changed. I probably need to look at the current cell, what the value is or something. So, but you get the idea where you've got these validation methods, so you could put some logic in, where I could probably just say e dot value and I'll probably have to cast that again as a date time. So that may well, probably didn't need to do that casting of the row, but we can try it. It may or may not work, but needs a bit of, obviously that's just on the fly, just trying to wire up the event handler for the validating event. So if I look at that, so if I try and set it to the 30th, so it steps in, the value didn't like my, I think because it's a string, I'd actually have to do a datetime.parse. Datetime.parse, and even probably cast it to a string as well. Let's try that one. So click the 30th, hit return. Yeah, so now that should be firing correctly. So I should be able to now set it to the 14th, hit return. No, I'd have to have a look at the why when you've changed it once then it doesn't seem to accept the new value. I mean, I can hit escape and go back, but that's not ideal. And it should accept the 13th, possibly not. Anyway, I won't waste too much more time on it. But you've got the idea, just to give you an idea of how you could perform and generate an editable grid, which this has probably had about 3 or 4 hours work from me. Would need a bit of polishing up, but seems to work okay. Obviously I could add the option where you could insert a new row, and it gives you a little blank row you can click, type in the new details. Obviously then you'd have to create a factory class to do the create, so we'd be involving the map, where you could use the same map contact to entity, but instead of having update contact and using the update method, you'd have to use the create method and just pass a similar record in, but you'd probably have to generate, instead of passing the ID, so you couldn't probably use the same method actually, instead of passing the ID from the existing contact record, you'd either have to add something to a constructor here to set a new GUID, or design a new mapping class that basically passed a new GUID in as the ID, because it won't have a pre-existing GUID because it's a new record. But you've got the idea. I just wanted to show you something I've been working on of late, which is this service calendar, which I've put up on my website, the crmdeveloper.co.uk sort of shop. So in service, you've got the standard, which you're all probably familiar with, the standard service calendar with your resources and your individuals, and so you can go back and view appointments, but you can't do a great deal with them other than just double click them to open them. So I've been working on a version of my own, which is this interactive service calendar, which if I just probably can't hide that ribbon bar, so I've just messed around with a trial license of my own. So I can view, I've got this time bar where I can obviously stretch it to however many days I want to view and slide it around. Obviously click on an individual day to go back to it, and then the nice thing is that you can now, so if I want to change the length of that appointment, so it's till 12:30, it's changed that test appointment, and I can double click it and it opens the normal standard CRM record. You can see it's updated to 12:30. If I want multiple resources on it, so if I wanted myself to be a required part of that, it's not recognising me, so it's added multiple resource, save the record, I'm not available apparently on that time, close it, do a refresh. Now I've got, obviously that's why I wasn't available, because I've already got a service activity booked on that time and date, so I could then move both along to just after that one terminates. That one finished at 11, I'll start the next one for this appointment at 11. Obviously it's updated that accordingly, so the new start time of 11 o'clock. It can be moved from person to person, so if I move it up to Barry, it's obviously, because it doesn't know which two resources, it's now allocated that to a single person. I've got obviously settings for you to define the colours yourself and the start time, so if at the moment I've got it visual that 7 AM is the start of the day, I could move that to 5 AM, or you can type a time in, hit save, and it'll move the new time. It's got the non-working hours displayed, so if you, obviously this Barry starts at 6 AM till 2 PM, and it reads each of them on a per user basis. You can filter by team, so I can click on the CRM team or engineers or multiple, or reset, and it brings back in the resources. Obviously you can, as I say, just refresh to bring in, can go back in. Oh, I've just dragged my time bar enormous, so I can move in bulk. So there I've got a bunch of appointments. I can shrink the window down again. Let me just shrink the time bar, bring that down to, so I can see a week's worth of appointments for various people. Completed ones are displayed in green. Obviously you can define the colour, so if I wanted them to be orange, I can save. Probably have to, it's a bit temperamental on the, I think it's easier to reload for the colours, something I'm looking at, so ignore that my trial message, but I can go back to that same time period, and now we can see my modified colour. So my completed ones are now in this horrible orange colour, but yeah, you get the idea. It's obviously visible in my shop. If you want to go and have a look and download a trial version, it's probably got a few weeks trial version. If you want an extension, just drop me an email or fire me a message. So it should be available. Obviously, if it's any of you guys that are subscribers, obviously you can look at giving you some sort of discount if you're interested in actually purchasing, or giving me feedback if you feel the price is too much. Obviously it's a work in progress. It's a fully working product, but I intend to keep extending the functionality over the, well, indefinitely really. I'll be adding, obviously you can also, yeah, if I double click, it brings up the ability to add for that slot. So if I've double clicked on, what was that, the 15th of April at probably 4 o'clock in the morning, I can add a new task, and it will obviously populate the time and date, so it's 4:45 in the morning. Likewise, so if I click on, let's just pick up one of the days, so we can clearly see the slot of it. So 9 o'clock, I can double click a slot, I can set up any of these standard activity types, so I can create a new appointment, and that will start the appointment off at 9 o'clock. Obviously the default is 30 minutes long. You can't at the moment with JavaScript pass in multiple parties, so I can't set the require, which is a bit of a pain. But I'm trying to find a workaround for that, because obviously this calls standard JavaScript methods to initialize certain parameters on the form, which certain ones are totally possible to do. But yeah, so it obviously gives you that ability to work out of the calendar, and if you need to book, and obviously you can copy, so I can take that appointment, hold control down, drag it down beneath and set it at 10 o'clock, and I've got a copy of that appointment for John, which I can then change the net. Obviously if it had any other resources like well, any other type other than users, it will retain them, so I can then rename that independently, or even meeting. Save that, close it, hit refresh, and then you've got, that's an independent, obviously a brand new appointment, so it's got the new details. I can hover over it with the tooltip. I don't have customers listed on appointments because they are part of sort of the required field, where I think on the, don't know if I've got any on, I've probably got one over here. Obviously the service activities do, so if I open a service activity, it does have defined customers, which is a multi-party. That can be more than one customer. So that will obviously show as a comma separated list of customers. But yeah, have a look at it. There's in here there's if you go to the interactive service calendar, there's a trial which obviously charges you nothing. You'll have to register, set up an account. Feel free to download a copy. Say it's presently, I think it expires mid-June, but if you need an extension, just let me know and I'll send you a key. I'm including 12 months support and free upgrades, so as this evolves and I get feedback and I implement some of the new features and functions I want to implement and what others request, I'll be doing obviously new releases, and you'll be entitled to obviously free updates for that full 12 months after purchase. So yeah, have a look, and thanks for watching the video. Sorry it's dragged on a little bit, and if you get any questions regarding the Silverlight and the editable grid, drop me some comments or email, and I hopefully we'll get some more videos up soon, probably more specific CRM ones again, maybe a few more line of business applications and so on. But thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully be speaking to you again very shortly. Cheers, bye.